Welcome back to the Brittany Hughes Show, everybody. So a United States lieutenant with the Navy has just surrendered himself for a 3-year prison sentence in Japan for a crime that may not have actually been a crime at all and is probably most attributed to a medical emergency that caused an accident. Meanwhile, the Biden administration is reportedly offering to exchange a convicted Russian arms dealer nicknamed the Merchant of Death in exchange to bring Brittney Griner home from a Russian prison. And the disparity between the administration's response to both of these stories is absolutely shocking. So we're going to talk about both of these stories a little bit today and why I think it's so important, not just because of the potential injustice that this Navy family in Japan is facing and the disparity between these two cases, but also because I believe that this shows just how rancid our culture and this administration and our political sphere has become, that we are now determining what stories get play in the media and what stories deserve attention based on a social justice lens that has warped our ability, apparently, to see anything clearly. So please understand, as we get into this a little bit, I know that there are so many important topics that are currently facing Americans daily. I understand this is an administration that has actually spent the past week blathering on and splitting hairs about the definition of the word recession to try to make it sound like we're not in the economic dumpster fire that we are, thanks to a president that's too busy drooling on his own shoes to make a halfway decent policy. I know that gas prices are sky high. Even if they've come down a little bit, they're still over $2 from where they were under President Trump. I understand that inflation is still unmanageable. Grocery store prices are continuing to rise. Americans are feeling these things every single day, every single time they plunk down their credit card. It is increasingly difficult to cool your home in a very hot summer. We're now going to head into a fall where the same exact thing is going to happen, if not be worse, in order to heat your home. Energy prices are in the stratosphere. So there is no shortage of issues facing everyday Americans, and I understand that. And so I'm not trying to sidestep these issues, but I think that these are incredibly important stories when we look at how this administration has chosen to handle things. And we look at the travesties of injustice that the left loves to scream about, but will completely ignore when it's not convenient for this president, who, again, doesn't know his head from a hole in the wall, it seems. And if you are a family that finds yourself in a situation like what we're seeing over in Japan, and you are completely hung out to dry and no one is talking about it or looking like they want to help you, that I cannot imagine what this family must be going through. So let's talk about this story a little bit. For those of you who might not be familiar, it hasn't gotten a whole lot of play. I think that CBS featured it at one point. I know Fox News has done a couple of things on it. But for the most part, in the grand scheme of things, this story has gotten completely lost among the headlines. So this is Lieutenant Alconus. He's a United States Navy officer. He and his family were stationed in Japan, where he lived with his wife and his 3 young children. And he was actually set to be deployed. Now, this was in May of last year, not this past May of 2021. So we're talking about over a year ago, which I think is travesty number 1, that we weren't talking about this time last year. It's absolutely horrific that it has taken this long for people to even be aware of the basics of this story. So Alkonis and his family planned to go to Mount Fuji for a family trip because he was scheduled to be deployed shortly. So as a last minute family trip, they decided to go to Mount Fuji. If you're familiar at all with Mount Fuji, by the way, you know that it is exceptionally high. It's the highest mountain peak in Japan, and it's actually a really tough climb. I've never been. I know people who have climbed it. My father lived in Japan as a teenager, and I remember him telling me that that was an extraordinarily difficult climb, even as a young, fit teenage guy. It's about 12,400 feet, so way up there. And climbers of Mount Fuji frequently suffer from altitude sickness. It is not uncommon at all. So after coming back down the mountain, I don't know how far up the family actually made it, but after coming back down the mountain, they were driving home. And Lieutenant Alconus blacked out behind the wheel his car veered off the road and slammed into some cars that were parked outside of a restaurant and also a few pedestrians. Tragically, an 85-year-old woman was killed. Her 54-year-old son-in-law ended up passing away a few days later on January 11th, and her daughter, who was also her son-in-law's wife, tragically landed in the hospital. She did survive, but 2 people died as a result of this tragic accident. Nobody, and I do mean nobody in this story, is disputing that this was tragic. There was no winning here. No good happened here. What is in dispute, however, is what caused the accident in the first place. And this is where the story gets very interesting. So Lieutenant Alconus' family, who were the only ones who were in the car with him when this happened, said that he wasn't drowsy, nor was he negligent at all at the time of this crash. As a matter of fact, they said that he was in mid-sentence in conversation with his daughter when he blacked out from what was apparently some sort of a medical episode, even though they didn't know what it was at the time. And that's when he struck the parked cars and the pedestrians. Apparently, he woke up after all of this had occurred. So it wasn't like he just sort of nodded off and then came to. This was clearly some sort of a medical episode, and nobody knew what had happened. Now, it's going to be nearly impossible to know for certain what caused this, because shortly after the crash, he was arrested, immediately taken into custody, where he was held for 26 days in solitary confinement, and no medical care or medical exam was performed to try to get to the bottom of what had taken place here, what had caused this crash. So a neurologist apparently later diagnosed him with altitude sickness and said that that was likely the cause for his blackout, which caused the accident. The U.S. Navy backed up this diagnosis. Altitude sickness can often cause fatigue, dizziness, nausea, and in extreme cases, it can even cause you to go into a coma and can cause things like pulmonary edemas, blood clots in the brain, all kinds of nasty stuff. So prosecutors that were handling this case actually asked for the neurologist's report to be thrown out, saying that it was irrelevant to the case. And believe it or not, a Japanese judge actually agreed to that. So Alkonis wasn't able to use the neurologist report and the medical report that substantiated his story as evidence in his case. So the judge, on the other hand, who from what I understand had no medical expertise whatsoever, subjectively decided that it was unlikely and didn't sound correct that Alkonis would have simply blacked out with no warning while he was driving his car, and that it was more likely that he was already experiencing drowsiness and fatigue, and that he had simply refused to pull over and continued driving negligently, and then ended up falling asleep at the wheel, and that that's what caused the accident.
Alkonis has lost his appeal for a suspended sentence.
The judge didn't accept the Navy's assessment that he passed out from altitude sickness. In her opinion, he just dozed off, and if he'd been tired, she said, he should have pulled off the road.
This judge then found Alkonis guilty of negligent driving causing death and sentenced him to 3 years in a Japanese prison. That was in October. Now, in between May and October, when all of this was happening and getting strung through the courts, and none of us were any the wiser because it didn't make headlines in the United States, at least not any that I saw. While all of this was going on, Alkonis had actually offered to pay this family $1.65 million in compensation for their loss. Now, you might think, okay, well, you don't just get to pay over $1 million and then everything just goes away and the families forget about their loved ones and everything's just fine, right? That's not how this works. Well, apparently in Japan, that is kind of how it works. It turns out that this is in keeping with a Japanese custom.
Alkonis has apologized and followed Japanese custom in offering restitution to the victim's family, $1.65 million.
This was an extrajudicial payment, so this was not something that he was ordered to pay. It's a gesture in keeping with a Japanese custom called gomenasai. Now, gomenasai in Japanese means I'm very sorry. It's a formal way of saying I'm very sorry. And this gesture is meant to convey extreme remorse. It's a voluntary thing that you offer as penance, whether you meant to do harm or not. And it's usually a voluntary offer of money that results in a more lenient sentence from a judge because it is seen as your attempt to make things right, your acceptance that something bad happened, that you are at least partially responsible for it, whether you meant it or not, and that you're trying to rectify the situation and you're trying to make amends with the person or the people that you've hurt. According to reports, $1.65 million is an incredibly high amount for an offer like this. It was not within the family's means. They paid it by collecting money from family, from friends. They raised some of the money. Of course, they used some of their own. And it was an astronomically high amount to give to this family. But it doesn't seem like it resulted in a whole lot in terms of how the judge ruled. So the Pipe Hitter Foundation, which is a nonprofit justice advocacy group, and it's been advocating for Alkonis and his family, claims that members of the victims' families were actually attorneys who worked in the prosecutor's office that handled this case. They rejected his letters of apology that would have played favorably with the judge, and so there was this clear conflict of interest there where his case wasn't even being adjudicated without a conflict of interest, and that there were political powers at play, and that he was not given a fair trial. So even with all of this judge found Alconus guilty as charged and had sentenced him to 3 years in prison. And then most recently, the Tokyo High Court actually rejected his attempts, rejected to hear his appeal. Now, why? Because this seems like such a miscarriage of justice. Why did this happen? How could this have happened? It's quite simple, actually. So there's a perception among many countries where we have stationed military members that American service members who commit crimes or misbehave in other countries are often not held accountable by the U.S. military.
And there's a history of resentment against the U.S. military, which has more than 50,000 personnel in Japan. Many Japanese believe it has shielded those who've committed crimes from punishment.
That's kind of common. You've probably heard that. That's not exactly a huge secret. And it relates to our status of forces agreement with these countries. So a status of forces agreement, or a SOFA as it's called, many of you are probably familiar with this. It's an agreement between a host country and a foreign nation regarding the military forces that are stationed there. So in this case, us and Japan. According to our status of forces agreement with Japan, unless Japan has a really good pressing reason to hold someone in their custody for a crime that's committed, they are to remand custody of that service member back to the United States military, and depending on the crime, depending on the severity of the crime, further action can be taken. Now, this does not mean that military members are not held accountable. This doesn't mean that they don't face consequences. As a matter of fact, earlier this year, in 2022, a U.S. Marine was indicted for reportedly sexually assaulting a Japanese woman in Okinawa. After an investigation, the U.S. military actually handed him back over to Japanese authorities. But again, the U.S. military had a say in this. Now, that might not always be the case. Justice may not always be executed perfectly, particularly in the eyes of the public. But this is what a status of forces agreement is. And there's a perception, particularly in Japan, that oftentimes American military members get away with things abroad because they are protected as service members by the U.S. military. So if there is something that needs to be done to better ensure that justice is carried out fairly, I am always an advocate of this. I am not saying that this has always been handled perfectly. Far from it. Whether it's dealing with military members abroad or domestic criminals back home, we should always be striving to make sure that more is done to hold the guilty accountable and to advocate for the innocent. That is always true. So if this is something that needs to be looked at, or if Japan feels that it has a gripe over this, we can have that discussion. What is not acceptable is to try to make an example out of this lieutenant and his family, who clearly does not fall into the category of a malicious criminal who is intent on doing something harmful like sexually assaulting somebody. And when he has documentation stating that the circumstances were likely out of his control, that doesn't change or right the wrongs of any of these other situations. That doesn't rectify other miscarriages of injustice. That simply adds to the pile of injustice. Making this family continue to pay for something that they couldn't help doesn't solve that problem. All it means is that this man was an easy target to make an example out of, to appease a public thirst for blood, and to try to make an example out of a military member because of this public perception. That seems to be exactly what is being done here. And the fact that the Japanese government held this man, interrogated this man the way that they did, prosecuted this man, and is now imprisoning him seems to be a pretty cut and dry violation of our status of forces agreement with them. That's extremely problematic for two reasons. First of all, it strains our relationship with an ally, which Japan is. And it also puts extreme fear and doubt into the minds of military members and their families who are either stationed in Japan or could be stationed in Japan in the future. The idea that if they go off of base and something happens, even an accident, however tragic, that they could be prosecuted and jailed as part of some public spectacle to appease the lynch mob. That's extraordinarily problematic for our military members. As a military spouse, as someone who has family and friends who are stationed in Japan and in other places, who this instills a level of concern and fear that you could be sent off to a country, or your loved one or your spouse could be sent off to another country, and if something happens, they are on their own. Even with all of this, even with medical evidence in his favor, even with no sign of malicious intent, even with a status of forces agreement, Lieutenant Alconus was forced to remand himself to the custody of Japanese officials earlier this week. Here he is saying goodbye to his 3 young children who are now not going to see their dad for 3 years. And here's the kicker. So far, the Biden administration has said nothing. This has been playing out in Japanese court now for over a year. This didn't happen 2 days ago. This isn't the administration trying to get their crap together and figure out what to say or what they're going to do. This has been playing out for over a year. This family has been dragged through the courts in a foreign country in a language that many of them don't speak. Apparently the husband understands some, but the wife doesn't. And the Biden administration has not issued a single public statement on this issue, that at least that I could find.
A phone call from President Biden. He could call and say he's coming home. The other would be for the U.S. ambassador to Japan, Ambassador Emmanuel. He could request clemency on Ridge's behalf.
The U.S. Embassy has only said it's watching the case.
The United States Navy did tell the Stars and Stripes magazine that they were disappointed and that they felt that this sentence was disproportionate with the incident that happened, which they don't even believe was an actual crime. They believe was a medical episode that led to this fatal crash. And that's it. Ambassador to Japan, Rahm Emanuel, hasn't said a word. There's no statement that I could find that's been put out by the Department of Defense at large. The Biden White House hasn't put out a statement. Nobody has addressed this from the White House podium. Joe Biden hasn't said anything about this. This is a member of the United States military, of which Joe Biden is supposedly the commander-in-chief. And when you look at the government's response to this, silence. And that's absolutely amazing when you compare this to one of the most high-profile stories this week and over the past few months, which is that, of course, of Brittney Griner. Brittney Griner, who happens to have the benefit of not only being a WNBA athlete and therefore kind of sort of high profile, if you can call a WNBA star high profile, but she's also a female black lesbian, so that's at least 3 protected categories right there. She was jailed in Russia after she was caught in an airport with a bunch of vape cartridges containing cannabis oil. Now, I'm just going to go ahead and just throw in a caveat here. Don't take cannabis to other countries. I don't care if you think that it's fine. I don't care if you think it should be legal everywhere. I don't care about your arguments. I don't care if it's legal here. I don't care. You are a moron and a half if you take cannabis through any other country's airport, particularly a country like Russia, who doesn't like us very much, who is not very fond of Americans, and which quite frankly sucks as a judicial system, why on earth of all places would you take cannabis oil into a Russian airport? You're either so arrogant that you think that the laws and the rules don't apply to you and that nobody's going to look twice at you, or you're honestly that stupid. Now, was it a crime worthy of more than half a year in prison and the lengthy trial that she's being dragged through? I would argue no. I don't think that that's Russia's point. I don't think that they give one crap over whether or not Brittney Griner was vaping cannabis or whether she smokes a bong a day. I don't think that it matters one bit to them. I think that they saw an opportunity to make an example out of an American at a time when we are not very happy with them, and when they are at war with us, whether or not we're officially at war with them or not. Make no mistake, Russia is at war with us. And to make a political point, they saw somebody that was at least somewhat high profile and had the eyes of a nation, at least somewhat in the sports world, and decided to make an example out of her as sort of a power play posturing to this Biden administration that they know isn't going to do jack crap over anything. This is a president that can't even form a sentence, much less actually take control or exercise any kind of American power here. And I think that Russia knew that. And so I think that this was a power play, and I think at large she's a political prisoner, not because she did something political, but because that's what her imprisonment is being used as. So, do I think that she deserves what she's getting? No. Do I think that the Biden administration should work to secure her release? I'm fine with that. I don't like to see hostile nations take our people and hold them hostage for political gain. I don't really care whether or not this person shares my political beliefs or whether she was a WNBA star or just a regular Joe Blow. Doesn't matter at all to me. But what's interesting is that this story has gotten widespread media attention. So here's LeBron James harping about it, saying that Brittney Griner should even come back to the United States because we've apparently treated her so horribly.
Brittney Griner, she is in Russia. She's been there
over 110 days. Now, how can she feel like America has her back? I would be feeling like, do I even want to go back to America?
Okay, so first of all, it should be noted here that if you are overseas and you commit an actual crime, I mean an actual crime, I don't mean that you black out because of a medical episode. I mean that you commit an actual crime. It's not the United States' job to pull your fat out of the fryer. Again, that has nothing at all to do with whether or not Griner is being fairly held or whether she's been given a fair shake. I don't think that's necessarily true, but she did technically commit a crime, and it's not the scale on which you judge the United States' success or goodness as a country, whether or not we come to the rescue of somebody who basically carted drugs through somebody else's airport and got caught. Again, whether or not the Biden administration should work to secure her release is a different story, but that's more an act, I think, of mercy on our part and an attempt to get her home. So here are the steps that the Biden administration has taken over this one chick. President Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris both got on the phone with Griner's wife to reassure her that they were doing everything that they could to bring Griner home. Biden personally wrote a letter responding to Griner. The administration has put out a slew of public statements advocating for her release. They have spoken from the White House podium saying that the administration is actively working to that end. Biden signed an executive order that expanded federal agencies' power to sanction countries that wrongfully detain American citizens, which is a whole other constitutional ball of wax, by the way, all because of this case. That's how much response this has gotten. Beyond the media headlines, beyond the analysts talking about this case all the time on the nightly news, on the Sunday morning talk shows, beyond all of the celebrity hype over this, that's the administration's response to this one case. Now, it turns out that this week, the Biden administration has even offered to trade a convicted Russian arms dealer for Griner's release, along with that of Paul Whelan, who is a Canadian, British, and Irish citizen, and who was accused of spying, just to get Griner back. Here's what Biden is willing to do. According to CNN, the guy that Biden is willing to trade is a guy named Victor Bout. He's a Russian arms dealer who has been nicknamed the Merchant of Death.
This is the man nicknamed the Merchant of Death. Convicted arms trafficker Victor Boot, currently serving a 25-year sentence in the United States.
When arrested, he oversaw operations capable of delivering enough weapons to launch rebellions, fuel revolutions, and slaughter untold thousands of people. He was an accessory to violence on a scale that is beyond comprehension.
And now, according to sources briefed on the matter, the Biden administration has offered to return him as part of a proposed deal for 2 Americans the United States says are wrongfully detained in Russia, Brittney Griner and Paul Whelan.
And this dude has got a rap sheet longer than I could possibly read here. He was convicted in 2011, get this, of conspiring to provide material support to a designated foreign terrorist organization, conspiring to kill Americans, conspiring to kill American officers or employees, and conspiring to acquire and use an anti-aircraft missile. This guy, not a good guy. Not even, very, very bad guy. I would even go so far as to say. And apparently the Biden administration offered this deal to Moscow weeks ago. And Biden himself reportedly personally signed off on this proposal. All for the release of a woman dumb enough to cart drugs through a Russian airport. I have said it before and I will say it again. If this administration wants to advocate for her release because they believe that she's being treated unfairly and that she's being used as a political prop by a nation that hates us, I am all for that. I am all for getting Brittney Griner home. I'm all for getting any American citizen home that is being wrongfully treated by another country. I am fine with that. Not so much fine with releasing this dude to secure her release. Not okay with that. Not okay with releasing a dangerous arms dealer over it. Think that's a pretty crappy deal. Kind of Obama-esque, if you ask me. But I am fine with saying that she shouldn't be treated the way that she's being treated, that she's probably been mistreated. If you listen to her testimony in a Russian court, which was the first time she was able to give one this week, she claims that she was asked to sign papers that she couldn't read because they were in Russian, that she was spoken to in Russian and she didn't understand what was being said to her. I buy that. I buy that. Knowing what little I know about Russia and the way that they treat people and the Russian judicial system, I would buy all of that. But all of this is being done for this woman. And it's been splashed across the headlines for months. And this administration is dealing with it as strongly as they can to the point of absurdity because they are responding to a public outcry over a woman who is Black and a lesbian who has the benefit of being an athlete. Where is anything even remotely close to that response for a U.S. service member who was in Japan on orders from the United States government, who now has to leave his 3 young children and go to prison for 3 years because he blacked out behind the wheel of a car, did everything he could to try to make it right, and was still convicted in violation of a status of forces agreement, and will spend the next 3 years rotting in prison. Where is the Biden administration in all of that? Now, if I am missing something here, because I have read as much as I can get my hands on this, and I have listened to testimony from this family, if I'm missing something here, if there is some detail that I'm not aware of, if this guy blacked out because his blood alcohol level was, 0.14 or something, which I find very hard to believe because he's a Mormon, so likely he doesn't drink. But if there's some glaring detail that's been omitted from every single report that the United States government knows about, that the United States Navy and this administration knows about, they need to come out and say it. If we're missing something, if this wasn't such an obvious miscarriage of justice here, if this guy wasn't left hanging out to dry with his family, then this administration needs to clarify that. And so far, they've said exactly nothing. They have not even issued an innocuous statement like, hey, look, we're monitoring this situation and we are in talks with the family and we're staying on top of it and we are looking for justice and we are in this situation actively monitoring this and we will bring you more when we've got it. They haven't even said anything as vague and as helpful as that. The family says that so far, other than their Navy advocates, nobody has really reached out to them. They've spoken with Rahm Emanuel, I believe, once, but they haven't heard bunk from Joe Biden. If there's something that we're missing here that justifies releasing a convicted arms dealer for Griner by leaving this lieutenant to rot in a Japanese prison, this administration has an obligation to say so. Otherwise, I am left to conclude that this is an administration that picks and chooses who they're going to advocate for, what injustices they're going to seek to correct, and what issues they're going to make a big deal out of based on a social justice narrative and media attention and a public outcry, and not actual justice for those who they are more directly responsible for. If there is anyone, as LeBron James would say it, that this country has an obligation to, it is service members who are stationed in other countries and all around the world, putting themselves in harm's way to advance American freedoms and to protect us here at home. If there is anyone that this country owes to protect and to defend, whether on domestic soil or foreign, when an injustice is being carried out, it is these guys. But this administration would rather protect an NBA athlete who enjoys a privileged status as a minority protected class that has been dubbed as oppressed by the left than to defend one of their own whose family is now left empty for the next 3 years. And it is revolting. So we're going to stay on top of this story. I know that there are other pressing issues. And when I have to talk about topics, I get one podcast a week. And when I have to choose topics, I know that there is no shortage of issues that are pressing to the American people. But this is a travesty, and it should be screamed from the rooftops. And this guy should have been home yesterday. And it is directly on Biden that he's not. And with that, we're going to, like I said, stay on top of this story. I'm going to bring you more details as I have them. Until then, make sure you check out full episodes of The Brittany Hughes Show on Rumble, YouTube, Instagram, and Facebook. Head on over to iTunes, subscribe to The Brittany Hughes Show so that you never miss an episode. I will see you back here next Thursday. Have a great weekend.